Today, I'm speaking with Arie Stavchansky, CEO and founder of Dataclay. Dataclay is a really well-established company focusing on creating software products for motion designers, post-production professionals, specifically in the realm of data-driven video. Now, data-driven video has been around for a long time. If you know about it, you understand why it's valuable. But it's kind of a paradigm that I think is surprisingly not that well known, at least around motion designers and video folk in general. I'm personally just getting into it, and I think that as content velocity and kind of video becomes more of the main communication paradigm of the web, it's just going to become more and more normal in every producer's skill set. Now, Dataclay's primary and longest standing product is Templater. If you're new to it, like I've been recently, a kind of reductive way to describe it that I've heard Arie say is that it's kind of like mail merge for video, but of course it's like way more in depth than that. Arie created this a long time ago, 10 years ago or something like that, to automate parts of the reversioning process. And for non-video folk, reversioning is kind of like taking existing video content that you've made and repurposing it or adapting it to suit different platforms, markets, languages, resolutions, things like that. But this original tool has grown so much more since then. And the use cases for this are specifically, or especially with the other products that Dataclay have, is just really exciting for the future of video, motion, and things like that. So there is obviously so much interesting stuff that went on in this interview around the intersection of at the intersection of software design and motion, the main topics of this podcast. We talked about things like what data-driven video actually is, why After Effects is actually so resilient despite competitors, and how it sort of has stuck around for so long, because Dataclay's main products are After Effects focused. We talked about AI Gen, because that's an area that Arie is obviously very well placed to talk about, and it's specifically in its relation to data-driven video. Talked about media credibility, which is a new term for me, building Slack bots that generate video, the future of Dataclay, and much, much more. So as always, if you appreciate the show and you want to support it, please share it with a colleague or a friend that you think might like it, or leave a review on Spotify or iTunes or wherever you listen. So I hope you enjoy this interview with Arie Stavchansky. So Arie, I got you on because I really want to dive deep into data-driven video and kind of have a conversation about that, and what also we think the kind of future skill set of video producers looks like, because everything's changing so fast and you're deep in this area. Data-driven video is very much like an area that's very new to me, but I'd also like to discuss the kind of the role or relationship with it and AI generated content, which is obviously coming on the radar of every video producer and motion designer right now, more and more. And as you said to me in a previous email, there's like a really interesting kind of comparison or convergence between those two things, and I'd love to dive deep into that. But let's begin with kind of like just a look back to the early days of kind of how you started out in this, because if someone like me is new to this, they might think that data-driven video is kind of quite new, but actually even before you, this was going on in industry. And maybe you can tell us about how you started, how long ago that was, and kind of what the reception was back then.
Yeah, I think the spark started in 2014. So it's been about a decade in the making. And, I'd have clients or I'd work in studios where producers were like, we need to make multiple versions of this really great creative that you've done. And, Flash was a big thing back in 2014. And, I would suggest Flash to do things like that, to do things like reversioning and, make sure that the code would, change certain displays up and things like that. But it got to the point where, video and After Effects in particular allowed artists to do really cool things that Flash just simply couldn't do. And so, I'd say it started back then when, Flash was kind of on the way out. It was dying. And, the quality of Flash is nice, but it's also very much not video. It's very plasticky looking. It's flat. It's 2D. And, there's a place for that. But you can't really push the pixels as much when you're working solely on a vector-based application. And so I started thinking about how can we get video to be dynamic, so that I could satisfy my own itch of, plowing through these reversions so I didn't have to act like a robot, right? I didn't go to school. I didn't, practice my creativity to act and behave like a robot. And so I thought it was the perfect opportunity to kind of use code. And, Yeah, I mean, that's kind of how it started. I knew that After Effects was a very open platform in terms of its SDK, and I think that's part of Adobe's value system is to make sure that their apps can be extended, and it's a very extensible application. So, I started exploring it, I started diving into it and learning the details of how to manipulate composites through code, in particular ExtendScript. But that's really how it started. This idea of, how do we get video to be dynamic? How can we make the experience for the designer one that is satisfying and desirable and useful so that they can create, motion graphics with this kind of data-driven aspect. Yeah.
And how was data-driven video, to put it simply, done before you started? Like, how did big studios, how did big like sports events and things like that?
Sure.
And
Sure.
maybe
Yeah.
you can dive in a little bit to, it's not just swapping out text for like multiple
No. Yeah.
versions. There's a lot of other stuff for someone who's completely new to this.
Yeah. Well, so a lot of it comes from real-time graphics that, as you mentioned, is in broadcast, right? Those kinds of systems were very inaccessible to your average motion graphics designer. And, we're talking high costs, very esoteric training, just really concepts that weren't being taught in schools at the high school level or even college. You kind of had to be in the industry to learn about how to design a template that could ingest data and not only ingest it, like swapping out text, but also configure it so that the design would maintain in terms of the look and feel of what a creative director wanted. So it's, this idea of, having a dynamic text layer isn't so simple as just swapping the text. You have to consider the things like glyphs. You have to consider things like the scale factor of a text layer as the amount of characters changes, right? There's other things like actual graphics, raster graphics that have to be swapped out. And because it's an audio visual medium, you also have to consider elements that have inherent duration, like footage elements, and how to deal with, different timings for every version that you're asking the system to create. So I think what was happening, the other thing I want to mention is that in video games, I used to work for Sony Online Entertainment. I was working on the UI for DC Universe Online, which was a MMO for, DC fans. And I was working on the UI, and one of the things that I was working on was the localization aspect of the UI. And that's when I was introduced to this product called Scaleform, which was eventually got acquired by Autodesk. And what it allowed people to do, or developers to do, was build UIs in Flash, and then it knew how to reconfigure the elements in the Flash, the Flash output, the I don't know how to describe the runtime, and it would handle things like scale. It would handle things like swapping fonts for different languages. And so I got an exposure to that. And that was like in, I'd say, 2009-ish, 2010. So I had already explored or kind of been introduced to the dynamics of visual content, at least. And so that's really what was happening before I kind of was like, this is something that your average Adobe Creative Cloud user needs to like know about and have access to. And that's kind of when I went on this route of, building something for that community. And it started off just, at my workstation, kind of tinkering. Eventually, I got to this place where, I was able to connect Google Sheets, which was one of the first spreadsheets that had an exposed API. And I was able to get After Effects to talk to Google Sheets, which was like amazing at the time. And
Do you remember that moment when you first did it?
I did. I was like, I remember finishing it and I was driving down the highway and I was like, I got Google Sheets to talk to After Effects. What did you do today? Like I was just like riding high, it was just it was very gratifying. And, I just felt like everybody needed to know about this. Everybody needed to know that suddenly, you could have something in the cloud, you could have data in the cloud, and
Hmm.
After Effects could, read from that data. And
Hmm.
there were, Adobe was kind of tinkering with things like that in those days in 2014, but it was very like much focused on like the tutorials that would come up on the home screen, or, it wasn't really about the actual, visual content that artists were making.
Yeah.
But it was I've always been fascinated about what humans can do with their own handiwork, and kind of the awe-inspiring nature that what we create we're actually impressed by. And that was one of those moments where I was like, what have I done kind of thing. And yeah, so, you know, I took that little creation, and I'm sure a lot of your audience knows about aescripts.com. And I presented it to them, and I was like, would you feel like you would want to, sell this through your site? And they immediately agreed, and they were like, this is amazing. Like, you've really created something here where, we don't, we support local files with our product, right? Like as a data source, but it was the first product that kind of decoupled the data, where the data existed, from the actual creative application on the desktop. And so that's eventually how we got our start, is through AE Scripts. And I will never forget their their openness and their help. It was really a great relationship, and we still have a partnership. They're our only exclusive authorized reseller at this point.
Wow. Cool.
So yeah.
Yeah. I got to have a scripts people on soon. I'm speaking to Remco from Scenery, and who's done a bunch of After Effects plugins as well. And I'm sure I can find a way to the top there. I've spent so much money at AE Scripts over my life.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
so so you touched on there, like just going back to that moment when you were driving down the highway and you were really excited. Like you clearly are someone who's had a vision for this way of working for a very long time. And again, I just want us to like stay close here to like expanding people's minds about like why we need data driven video. Like I think most people would understand the live use case. It's like, oh, this player's come off, like we need to like render his name or her name, like that's fine. But and maybe like translating one video into 10 languages, people can get that. But like kind of give us a broad overview of we can dive into the sort of the verticals and the land and the clients later, but give us a kind of as broad as overview as you can, as like why do we need data driven video other than just like I need to render these 100 small variants.
Yeah, I mean, I think so. Obviously, from the production side, it's all about saving time, like you mentioned, right? But that, I think, for me, coming from as a producer myself or as a designer, I realize like this is a great thing. I can save time. I can focus on the creative aspect and the storytelling, and not worry about the, mundane data entry and mundaneness of like double clicking my way through life, right? Nobody wants to dig through comps and change things like,
Can I jump in here actually? Do you know what? I
yeah,
think my question is flawed because I'm not experienced. Like I've never worked in like a large studio and I've never had to deliver like loads and loads of projects. So actually it's coming from a bit of naivety here. So maybe you could give people like me more of an appreciation for why this is so important. Like
yeah,
what deliverables really are in big video business.
yeah. So I mean, localization is a huge thing. Like when you go and you fly in it to different airports, and you see the digital signage, and you see the ads coming from large corporations, when they go to an agency, it's not just that they create a one-off. It's not enough anymore. With the proliferation of digital signage, and the abilities of what we have now with technology, people expect the content that they're viewing in the place that they're viewing to be relevant to that geolocation. It's kind of expected at this point. So, when let's say you're a car company, and that car company goes to an agency, and they say, we need to have this ad for, the United States market, plus the Latin American market, plus the, Australian market. It's not enough to just be an agency that says, here's your ad anymore. It's just, you're looking at some creative director having a vision, creating something great, but then there's a part of the process that is so mundane and robotic that really people with skills like you and me don't really want to do. Like, it's not fun. And so there's this, need to kind of collapse that difficult labor into something that is still labor. It's not taking away anybody's job, but it's making it more pleasant. So on the production side, I think that's why what we create is needed. Uh, why our tooling is needed. Now, in terms of the consumer side, it's like I mentioned, the idea of relevance, the idea of identification with the content, that's becoming more important. Where these companies, these large enterprises, need to make connections directly to specific people, or even groups of people, or locales, and so it's becoming a critical thing for them to create content that is relevant to their consumers or to their customers. And the other thing is that a lot of people don't understand how to create video. It is not a easy skill set to acquire. It's not an easy skill set to really advance in very quickly. And so what data-driven video does is it allows people who might just have a mobile app to choose a template, upload some UGC content, right? A video that they took with their phone, and then it gets processed through a system that they have no idea about, but that's using software like what we create to output something that is like, new, customized. So, there's this whole idea of like, it's not just about venue graphics at an arena or the lower thirds in a news station. It's also about fan experience with things like teams, like sports teams, or you did a marathon and you need a summarized video of how you did at the marathon, or there's or you attended a gala and you want a thank you message to be sent to each attendee. That's really why we want data-driven video. There are so many applications. And, I'd say from the Hollywood perspective, we've all seen, well, maybe not everybody, but like films like Minority Report, right? Where, you see Tom Cruise walking around a mall and all this content is like, geared to this one individual. And it's like that for everybody.
Is that where you're headed? Is that where Dataclay is headed? That's your
I
vision, right?
think so. I think ultimately, yes, it would be great to be able to automatically create holograms for people based on their retina. So, but it is. I think that those are the main reasons. It's really about feeling a connection with the content that you're consuming and feeling like it was made for you, and not this generic message that is supposed to blanket, an entire country. That's really what
That's
it is.
great. That's really helpful. Thank you for that.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
so diving into the specifics, and we can talk about the product, talk about clients in a bit. Like what can be driven by data right now, and maybe how has that changed over the lifetime of Dataclay? Like I can imagine colors, resolution, text, footage, like yeah, and how does that come together? What can be changed in a composition?
Yeah.
Resolution, I think I said as well. Like I know you have a particular technology as well, which is about like time sculpting as well. So
Yeah.
time is also.
Time is definitely one of the big things. That's where we really excel at. And in fact, we have a US based patent on our methodology for artists to author timelines that are dynamic. And what that means is, like, as you mentioned, footage can be reversioned automatically. But that opens a huge problem, which is, well, what happens when in one version your footage is 10 seconds and the next version it's 5 seconds? What happens to all the elements that surround that footage? So that's what time sculpting is. It allows the author to set up rules to tell layers what to do when a main layer or an anchor layer that you're changing is being reversioned automatically. And that is a problem that maybe 2 years into having released the first version, which absolutely did not support any time-based manipulation, we recognized that that is what the customers wanted. They were writing in about that. And we devised a solution that was very well received and eventually got patented. And it's a very unique aspect of our tool set. But aside from footage, obviously audio can be reversioned, which is a huge thing for voiceover, dubbing, things like that. And colors, but not just colors. Any kind of parameter that's in an effect can be reversioned. So, if you have a third-party effect and you want it to be reversioned with our software,
Right.
that's totally possible. So in one instance, you might have a blur that needs to be really high. In another instance, you might have that same blur parameter to be low.
So you'd be
So
like, Spain doesn't like blurs. Like people in Spain don't like blurry content. We need to, but the
exactly.
UK do something like
No,
that.
but I
A
mean, it
stupid
just depends.
example, but you know what I mean.
I'm just saying that it's something that is like it's doable, but like you can imagine, like, for example, uh, a green screen or some kind of chroma key technology that's being used in the template, right?
Hmm.
And maybe that you in one version it needs the spill needs to be cleaned up more so in the next version. So a parameter can be driven by external data depending on what else is being fed into the composite.
So this almost like this is why I love talking with people like yourself because it's like it brings together the three or two of the things that I'm well three of them the software design and motion the three kind of real topics for this podcast. Like with a product like yours, like a video developer, a video producer becomes a little bit more like a programmer. Like you're thinking about eventualities and plugging this into that and driving that from that and if this then that.
Right,
Like
right.
obviously being you have data behind everything. I found that really interesting. So presumably some people have taken this like really far. Like, have you like where have you been really surprised about how template has been used, or indeed anything
Yeah.
in data play that's like
Yeah,
really surprised you in terms of functionality?
sure. I mean, I think so. I think the systems-based approach that some of our customers take is really fascinating. Meaning, one of the additions of our software of Templator uh, effectively turns After Effects into a server. And what that means is that it's always on and it's just waiting for new data to arrive.
Do you mean
When
that After Effects is in a server somewhere, or that like your local machine is sort of serving content
No,
or
no, I
render?
mean that it doesn't matter where the machine is. If the machine's in front of you or elsewhere, it doesn't matter. My point is that when you turn on our bot feature, basically what it does is it turns it into what's called a daemon in computer science, right? And a daemon, all that does is waits for something to happen. That something is when new data arrives. When new data arrives, Templator tells After Effects to reversion a composite and kick out a render. So a lot of our customers, what they've done is they have built web interfaces or other interfaces, chat interfaces that send data to a data source that Templator is connected to. Templator recognizes when new data is entered by an end user on that web UI or chat UI, and new content comes out the other end. And that can be distributed in any way that they see fit. Those kinds of systems I think are really fascinating because what that means is that all of a sudden you have developers who are front end developers and sometimes full stack developers who are creating these systems that or these interfaces, these apps that basically talk to AE through our app.
Mm.
And that is when I see some stuff like that, it's fascinating. One of the things we did about 4 years or 5 years into the company is there's a studio out in the UK called Cub Studio. This guy Fraser Davidson, very very talented motion graphics artist, and he started this I guess side project or side company called MoShare, and it was a really great example of what could be done where he was creating these templates for soccer leagues and they created a web interface so that data could be input by somebody on the league, and then they would get like, an output that they could post to Twitter very quickly. And that was kind of the first time I was like, wow, that's a that's a really cool use of our software. And then from that, eventually the NFL here in the United States, they recognized like this is pretty cool. And so we worked with the NFL directly to build a Slack chatbot where their marketing team could just say, they could enter in, I want this template, and then it would ask, okay, well, what else do you want? And it would have a series of questions the bot would say, and then it would say, what's the data? And then the marketing person would enter it in, and they would get content in the Slack chat in the Slack interface that they could then download and then post to the whatever social channel they wanted. And the goal with the NFL was that they got tired of the creative team being bothered by the sales and marketing team. They didn't want there to be a bottleneck anymore. And so they saw our software as this kind of release of that bottleneck where we could just create a system, the creatives could build the templates, and then, the marketing people could say to their interns or whoever, go to the Slack chatbot, get something for the social channel and post it. And so since then, it's like, it's kind of taken off into its own or there's like a lot of different companies doing that kind of thing with our software. And then one of the things that I thought was interesting as well was during the NFT craze, there was a lot of companies that used our software to create these like reversion collectibles. And then they would mint them. I don't know how they do it, but they would mint the outputs from Templater and AE to to make them I guess collectibles for people to buy. I'm not sure exactly how it all works, but one of the companies is Dapper Labs, and they've licensed a lot of content from the NBA and a lot of the major leagues here in the States, and they're creating content automatically with our software to mint, and it's a fascinating thing for me to see it used in that world as well. So, I just think that this whole idea of, I think Adobe calls it content volume and content velocity. I think that's kind of like, it's a force that really can't be stopped. And I think it's just because there's so much data out there. It's just like, producers they didn't have a way to cope with all this data. Video producers did not. And, now they finally do. And part of the thing is our solution. And there's other players also, like Spotify does the everybody knows the Wrapped thing, right? That's all data-driven content. I don't know if they're still doing video. I think they might be, but it's that's an example.
It was really
Yeah.
interesting this year to see Notebook LM piped into that. Like, I don't know whether you got that this year. It's like, oh, okay, so like AI gen coming into data-driven stuff. Like, that's really interesting. Got a podcast on everything I listened to this year.
Yeah,
I'd love to dive into that with you about Templater in a bit.
sure.
Sorry, I interrupted.
It's okay. No, I'm just saying that it's just something to contend with. So the world is heading that direction with regards to content. There's expectations that society at this point has for the content they consume and how frequently we are all consuming it. And the producers just have to have the tools to cope with it. So, yeah.
Yeah, fantastic, great answer. Yeah, like when you were talking about the kind of like the constant sort of inbox kind of stuff that comes to a video team in a large company, it reminded me of like what IT teams go through. Like IT teams are really dealing with like 10% of what they could or should be doing, right?
Right.
And that's why like no code tools like Glide, the company that I work at, and other things is that's the promise there, is that there's either self-serve or you speed up that volume of like production, so that not just so that you can free up the people to be more creative on the main kind of like thread of work, but also so you can empower other people. It made me think a little bit, like that Slack bot is so relatable and would be so interesting. Could you just give us a high level overview of how that works? I'm still not totally clear about where After Effects is sitting. Is it sitting on like servers, or is it sitting on like machines in people's offices? Like, can you do both? Can you have like virtual machines with After Effects on them? and
Yeah,
like so
yes, you
you
can.
could just
You
have one
can.
person in the office and
No,
it would
no,
everything
you
come.
can. You can have a server, and these days you can have After Effects running on a server and actually use the UI of AE on that
Yeah,
server. You can remote in, right? So it's like that where you set up a machine that's dedicated to having After Effects and Templator always on, and that's all the machine does. You load it up with all the templates that are available that you want After Effects to open up and reversion and render. Once that's in place, you can have any application talk to it, but it talks to it through this kind of polling process, meaning like templator's on and it's just pinging the data source. So the front end apps aren't actually talking to AE. The front end apps are talking to the data source, and then templator's talking to the data source. And so that's kind of the bridge of
nice.
how the data comes in. But it's not, it could be a virtual machine. It could be on Amazon. It could be on Azure. It could be anywhere you want it to be and where you can support it. But it's not, some of our customers, specifically in the enterprise, don't actually want to have that in the cloud. And the reason is because they are so paranoid about where the output goes to. There is a security component to this kind of work that the enterprise really, really cares about. And any freelancer that's worked with an enterprise probably has dealt with some kind of VPN or some kind of issue with regards to security, or they have to come to the office or something. So a lot of our customers, they come to us from different, I would say, indirect competitors that they offer this rendering in the cloud, and the thing about that is that it's great in terms of you remove the headache of setting up the hardware, but the problem is that the end user really doesn't know where the output is going to end up. So there's a certain trust that has to be built into those services between the end user and that service. And so depending on your appetite for security, that may not work for you. And what we have found is that enterprise they would rather not. We have a customer, for example, that has, I think, something like 30 machines running AE plus Templator bot. And they co-located this rack so that they have control over the actual machine and the output, because the content they're making is for personalized media, meaning like a person's name gets baked into the video, plus other information like financial information. And so it's like having that be done on a server from a company that you don't trust, it's going to be very hard to win that customer over. So it's just something to to consider when thinking about how to build one of these systems. So with the NFL, they actually had a machine on-prem to do it, to do
Yeah.
the actual content reversioning and that kind of stuff.
So this would be a good moment to dive into the core products of Dataclay. Obviously, Templator we mentioned, and you've alluded to the other ones. But just before that, like have you ever been tempted to get into the kind of cloud rendering space, or have you basically just answered the question as to why you've not got a product that is in the
Sure,
cloud where people can render? Like, did you ever
sure.
think about?
Yeah, so part of it is Adobe, frankly. They're When we first started in 2014, they were very explicit about, you couldn't put AE on a server, and that was going to prevent us from doing a service like that. And so, I was like thinking to myself, because I wanted to do that at the beginning,
Right.
have it a service that just renders. And I actually built a prototype and I showed it in about, I think it was 2013 or 2012, I went to Seattle to the Adobe offices and I presented the application to them, which was a web application that was running AE in the back. But eventually they just were like, yeah, the license doesn't allow for this. And so I was like, you know what? I spent all this time building it. What can I do with this technology or this idea? And I thought, why not bring the cloud directly to the people's workstations, right? And so that's when I decided I'm going to build a whole GUI just for the authorship of the template, for a dynamic template. And so eventually what happened was I built that product and people could install it. They'd have to agree to the EULA. It wasn't violating anything about Adobe's end user license agreement. And we found that actually customers appreciated it more than going to these services that were online and that would render directly for them. So that's part of it. Part of it was a legal aspect. That's why in the beginning we never went after that. Eventually, Adobe saw, this was, we built Templator before Creative Cloud. We built it for, I think it was CS6 was the first version of AE. So before Creative Cloud was out, Templator was out. And so when Adobe started realizing like, oh, the cloud is where it's at, I suddenly saw companies offering remoting into virtual machines with AE running. And I was like, okay, Adobe is kind of a little bit more comfortable with that.
Mm.
But because we understood the ideas of security and the needs of the enterprise, I never really pursued it. Now, don't get me wrong, it's something that I'd love to do, but I have found that every time we land a huge license deal with an enterprise, they don't want anything to do with a cloud system. Like
Yeah.
they would prefer to build their own cloud system. So what we've done is we've created a tool that allows them to build one of these like render in the cloud systems that they have complete control over. So we kind of built like a screw basically for these people to build a larger entity. Whereas a lot of the indirect competitors out there, they've already built that castle in the sky, but they're not enabling other people, developers in particular, to build their own, to roll their own. And I think that's that's kind of the space that we want to operate in.
Mhm.
But some of our customers, what they'll do is they'll use Templator on their desktop. They'll create the outputs like replicas of the AE projects, and they'll send those projects to something like Deadline. I'm not sure if you know what Deadline is, but Deadline is a application that ingests After Effects projects among other types of formats, and it will render them like in a kind of a sequence. It's kind of like a queued based rendering application. And Amazon bought Deadline. Amazon, it's on AWS now, so you can take the replicas from Templator and send them to a cloud server to be rendered. And so that's another way that people use our software is where they don't want to, they know that this service is out there, but they don't want to build the entire thing. So, there's many ways to go about building systems with this. It's just that our software happens to be one of the many tools that these businesses or these organizations build those systems.
Mhm. Okay. So yeah, I think this would be a great moment to kind of just do a quick overview of the three or potentially four. It's primarily three, am I right? And then you have
Yeah,
like autographs, which are more like
right.
template.
Right, right,
Yep.
right. So
Yep.
Templator is the flagship that lives inside of After Effects. It enables authors like you and I to build templates really quickly and preview how data looks. Then we have a product that we call Q, and that was our second product. Q is a cloud-based data management platform. So it's kind of like our version of Google Sheets. I almost kind of like to call it, because Airtable has more customers. It's like Airtable, but meant for Templator, meant for video producers. It's like all it does is it ingests data and then it feeds data into Templator. So with Q, you can use like a no-code platform and get data from any app and pipe it into Q through our REST API. And once it's inside Q, Templator can pick it up. So it's like a fancier, more robust version of a spreadsheet in the cloud. That's really what it is. But there's a lot of features that come with it. And then we have a new product that is currently in beta, but we are very hard at work getting it into general availability this quarter. That is called Projector. And what that does is it takes output from Templator and it deploys that output to various platforms for streaming and storage. And so it takes all the metadata from those streams and writes that metadata back to the original data source that Templator used to create the content. So what this means is, let's say you have 100 versions or 1,000 versions you need to render out and get onto a streaming platform. Well, you got to know where all those URLs are. So, and those URLs need to map to the actual the content that was output. So, this product handles that in an automatic fashion. And, we built it because we knew the customers wanted it. We didn't build it because we thought it would be cool. We built it because we got a lot of influx of support tickets asking for this. And currently in beta, I think we had something around like 80 beta users or 70 beta users or something like that. And one of the customers is just so enthusiastic that they don't mind licensing the beta. So it's already being used in production. It's just that there are kinks that we know that the users would be annoyed about. So that's why it's not out of beta yet, but it's
Are you allowed to say any of the beta users or not quite yet?
no, I can't at this
No, fair
point.
enough.
But it's really, I mean, in the world of broadcast, this kind of software is already built. They call it playout software, where it's like it's the kind of software that just takes output and orchestrates it. It orchestrates the media so that it can get in the right place at the right time.
What's a comparable piece of software that maybe we won't know about, but is like widely used?
Yeah, so you have companies like Ross Video where they'll create this kind of software for newsrooms where maybe they have a different application creating the content, but then they have to have a kind of an intermediate application to orchestrate when that content should be displayed on the actual live feed. So it's kind of like that, where it's after the output's created, but before it gets out there and published. And we call it projector because it's essentially projecting the content for the end user. So it has an integration with Vimeo so that you can get your content onto Vimeo easily. They have a great API. It supports JW Platform, which is another streaming provider, and we plan on providing or integrating more providers. It also integrates with AWS's S3 storage facility, and so it's it's a way for users to archive the content that's being automatically produced, so they don't worry about it being deleted and things like that. And then finally, we have what we call autographs, and that's a kind of a contraction of the word automatic graphics, but I think this is kind of a good way to kind of talk about AI and that kind of thing. But the idea is that, an author was there and a human being was there to create the template. So it's kind of like their autograph, right? It's their signature. And so the philosophy at Dataclay is that we never want the author to be out of the picture. We never want the human to not be the source of the magic. And I think that's kind of the difference between, a lot of what is happening in the Gen AI space and what we've been doing and the way we want to continue to go down this path. And so, that's why we call them autographs. So what we did was we contracted with, several authors, and they put together these templates that work with Templater. But not only are they just downloadable templates, the templates ship with these data structures that are already, ready for end users to kind of pipe in and to see how the data looks. So it's not that they just get the template; they get the template plus sample data, and that's what autographs are. And our initial model was that you would pay for different amounts of or quantities of renders. So, if you wanted like something, I can't remember what it is on the site, but like 0 to like 200 renders is one price. 200 to 500 is another price. And then 500 and above is unlimited is another price. And what we found is that we did have some customers when we first launched it, but we found that our price points are likely too high for the market that we're targeting. So we are trying to figure out how to deal with that in this year. We're going to address the licensing model for autographs this year to hopefully make them more successful. And the goal is to actually get more artists involved and become one of these stock sites for templates, kind of like a Artlist or a Pond5, but just specifically for this notion of reversionable templates.
This is fascinating. I love this stuff. So just, I really want to go onto the AI gen and the content philosophy stuff that we talked about, because I know that's really important to you, and I'm sure you'll have great stuff to say. But before we leave AE land, I want to just like talk a little bit about like being an AE centric product. You mentioned earlier on in the interview that like After Effects and Adobe is very open, and maybe to the non-developers, you could just kind of explain a little bit about what that means, and what that's allowed you to do, and then maybe you could talk about, if there are any, like some of the downsides of being only AE centric, if there are any. Like AE is 10, I think it's interesting, like friends of mine or colleagues who aren't like deep motion designers tend to like badmouth AE. It's like, it's clunky, it's been around forever, there are all these new tools and stuff like that. But it is just, to me, like it feels a little bit like, like, yes, it sometimes feels like very classical computing compared to like new tools or using AI or whatever, but like it's so broad, like it's such a huge system with so many different like facets. It's so open, it's so configurable. So yeah, that was a long question, but maybe you could talk to why you stuck around with AE and any issues there.
Yeah, I think so. First of all, the extensibility is what I mean by it being open, meaning like you can, through code, tell After Effects to pretty much do most of the functionality that you can do on the GUI. And that's a big deal for a developer with a platform like AE. And I think that's one of the reasons why we stuck around. But it's not just that. It's like the developer community that's built around that. Like the developers, the third-party developer community is really fascinating. Like they're really, really smart, talented, helpful individuals. And so, working in that space, you never feel like you're at a loss. Like you always feel like you're going to be able to accomplish what it is that you're going after. So that's a big deal. I think that, for a non-developer who might need to make their lives easier because they have a repetitive process, they can do it. And especially now with Gen AI doing the coding for people. Like I'm sure you've heard of GPT from Hyperbrew, where, you can ask ChatGPT within the After Effects interface for advice on how to code an expression or how to code an extend script. So that's really what it means to be an open platform, meaning like it can be extensible and, there's a community built around that. But as far as like being AE concentrate or concentrating on AE, I mean, I think that, first of all, Adobe does a great job of marketing and evangelizing. And so you've got this kind of captive market of professionals, pros. And a lot of these new tools that are coming out, for example, like Canva, it's a, how should I say it? It's yes, it makes it easy to create a video, right? But it's not professional tooling. It's just not. So what a newcomer sees as clunky and old, a professional sees as, this is amazing. I have so much control over every little aspect. And there's all these plugins that can do stylization, and there are, different things like our reversioning app, or there's, just new stuff that's coming out that Adobe just keeps on putting into from their R&D into After Effects. And it's like, it is a huge program. It is a very sophisticated application, but that's the market that I personally don't mind targeting. I think it's great. I think I want to target the person who really takes video content creation seriously over a person who's like, I need a quick one-off for my announcement of my, office party, right? Like it's not the same customer. And so you can only take some of those new tools so far before you realize like, yeah, this isn't enough. And I think I've never felt like that. I've never felt like, yeah, AE can't do this. I just have never felt that. And so that's one of the reasons why we've continued to develop with After Effects. Now, I will say, though, there are some tools out there, for example, Cavalry, which is it's more of a algorithm or procedural motion graphics tool. And, we are looking at places to recreate Templator for. And that is one particular platform or application that we'd like to be a host to Templater. And the thing is that it takes a long time to develop a robust application. And Templater for AE is just, it's been in development for 10 years. And moving or porting it to a different application is going to be a heavy investment. And so we need to know before we do that, is there the community? Is there going to be a reception for it? Is the same model that we use to price our software going to work in that world of Cavalry or a new application? And we've got interest from Adobe, even from the developer, community to consider Adobe Express as another platform to port something like Templater to. And
Interesting. Yeah, I didn't think about that. So that makes total sense.
yeah,
Things sound-
they're really pushing the mobile web stuff now, and they want the developers to put some investment into that. So we're considering how to use other platforms with the kind of workflows that we've kind of developed over the years. But that's all I can say about that. Like it's not that we hate everything out there besides AE. It's just that AE has been so good to developers and to making it easy to build that we stick around with it. But it's not to say that we won't ever support other hosts. Absolutely not.
So let's switch gears. I could stay here forever. I could nerd out. I could ask you about Cavalry. I could ask you about all the inside workings of After Effects, but we have to sort of make time.
Sure.
I want to return to this idea of content velocity, and hopefully we can lead into the AI sort of thing as well.
Yeah.
But like, this is a question from Carl Hamrick, actually, who was a guest on the podcast, but I reached out to people who listened to see any questions that they had. And he said, the long and short of it was really, how do you feel like automating video production specifically in After Effects has impacted the industry? Like, how has motion design changed in the last however many years?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. I know Kyle. We met up last summer. We met up last summer at this conference called Creative Pro Week. It's a great conference, but yeah, it's I'd say it's the way that the artists or the designers come to the table and how they think about the not the templates, but the graphics that they are building. I think the automation aspect of things is driving this change of how artists are putting text and audio and video, and they have to now think about, well, what happens in the case when this thing changes? And that used to not be the case. That used to be something that would be reserved for something like, Flash, and now Rive, for example, where, you've got, the whole thing is meant for interactivity. But with data-driven video content, it's not necessarily that it's interactive, although, you can find video in interactive runtimes. It's that, because it's a raster grid, it's not the same thing as being as flexible as like, a vector-based app, which I mentioned earlier. But it's that the artist now has to suddenly think kind of like an interactive designer, a producer for interactive content. And that's, I think, a big shift. And I also think it's something that they can add to their repertoire of skills so that they can offer it for their services. So, in terms of automation and just supporting campaigns, ad campaigns, or, whatever they're producing, automation enables them to offer something to their end customer when they're producing. And I think that is something that was difficult for them to do prior to the tooling for this kind of thing, meaning like they wouldn't know where to start if they had to support the creation of even 50 graphics, or they would find some script online, or they would roll their own, and it just became, there was no standardization. So I think automation really helps them understand how to deal with producing these kinds of these campaigns that have the data-driven content, but also like the idea that, for example, in sports graphics or venue graphics, we have several users who are, at this point freelancers, or small agencies that are building content for like huge arenas where tens of thousands of people show up and tens of thousands of people in a moment in time look at this content. And it's like, before our software, that kind of stuff was like esoteric systems in some back room that only two people knew. But because automation came into the picture for the designer class, let's call it, right? The creative cloud class, you all of a sudden opened up huge amounts of cool things that you could do for that content, right? That, for those one-up players, or, whatever, the interstitials that you might see during like a broadcast, or, it just really enables the idea of what's trending in design to get into those situations. Whereas prior, you would have, again, esoteric systems, very limited amount of people who knew how to use them and build for them. And so, things couldn't have the designs wouldn't have a lot of voice, or a variety of voices, right? And I think that's what this data-driven stuff is doing, is it's giving that kind of content multiple voices. And I think that's a valuable thing for society in general, but also for the content and the producers. So
If someone's never done this or really done this kind of work before, but they're a successful video producer or motion designer, like how would you suggest that they start getting into it? Maybe their clients don't actually need, or think they don't need, this kind of work done yet. So how would you pitch it? Or is it really just that, like, if you need data-driven video, if you need this kind of stuff, you need it, and so you ask for it? Are there, I guess I'm asking, like, are small to medium-sized businesses, could they benefit from this? And then if you're a video producer for that type of business, how would you pitch it to them?
yeah, they could definitely benefit from it. And I would pitch it to them as, install the software and give it a go. It's the learning curve for our software. If you know even a modicum of AE, like the basics, like a composition and what layers are, even if you know just that kind of thing, our stuff is really not that hard to pick up. A person can install the app at no cost. They can, start connecting a spreadsheet to live, or to a layer in a live sense, like a direct connection, and start previewing how data looks like within like a day's worth of learning. And then, beyond that, it's like, it's really about understanding the processes of outputting. But it's really about like understanding that the tool exists, but also being able to position the if an agency has a client and the client's like, we need to do this kind of thing where what they're seeing in Texas is different than what they're seeing in, California, which is different from New York. Like when they make that decision, it should not be a difficult thing any longer for an agency to be like, yes, we can do it. And I would say if you need to make your designs data-driven, then use our software at no cost to just try it out and go from there. Sorry about that.
Yeah, no problem.
I thought I have it at work. Sorry. Okay. So yeah, I mean that the pitch is basically like, don't be afraid of tackling these data-driven projects. There is software to support you, and as far as we're a small company. We at this point, it's a total of 7 of us, and our support personnel are amazing, and so we're there for the customer. When somebody writes into our ticketing system, we are there to help. We don't, we're not lazy. We don't think our users are dumb. We don't consider any questions stupid. Like we want this thing to really thrive, and we want people to take delight in the software. And I think that's that's something that I also would include in a pitch, is that, we are behind our customers, and I take service very seriously. I mean, I can't stand it when a company isn't like responsive to my inquiries, and so if I have that feeling, it's going to translate into what our values are at Dataclay.
So just as a last final question about, I hope anyway for now, the about Dataclay and the products. I wanted to kind of end with just like a question that came to me just yesterday, actually, about like if this is possible, because we're starting to think about it at Glide. And this was a potentially far out there question, but this might actually be quite an interesting one to like move into the AI gen space. So someone asked me like, would it be possible to generate a video for every customer, for every prospect that comes to like a product's website, that kind of would have like a sales pitch that would incorporate a dynamic script that's based around their business, that shows them relevant customer stories that we've done, that generates, like for us at Glide, generates sample apps, and then maybe even like AI generated video with like avatars or whatever. Like how would Templater pull that together at a high level? And yeah,
Yeah.
have you seen
Yeah.
people doing this sort of stuff?
Yeah. So to answer the first question, 100%, we already have customers doing that. It's a fantastic thing that they're doing. We actually had an e-commerce company doing that, like maybe a year into our releasing of the software. Every time, and they would do it where they would send them a customized video based on what they purchased. And it was like a kind of a thank you, but here's what you bought, and like here's how you use it. It was like a summary of the product, but in video format. That's totally possible if you want to, gather all the elements from other Gen AI platforms. For example, like a speaking avatar. It's totally possible. Now, the way that you do it is that you build a system that kind of creates all the elements outside of Templater, and then you use Templater as a glue. It's almost kind of like it's a composer, right? Like in After Effects, the thing that you're working in is called a composition. Composition comes from compose, and a composer is one who brings things together, right? So Templater is all it's doing. It's like a robotic composer. And what that means is that it needs elements to bring together. But outside of that moment of bringing it together into the composition, you can feed it anything you want. For example, you can, in the data source, you can specify an HTTP URL to a footage element, and Templater will download it to the machine and inject it into the composition in After Effects. So in other words, like you create the data with a Gen AI platform, like let's say HeyGen, right? Creating these avatars. They give you a URL. You get a developer to build something that, creates it through their API. You get the URL, you put it in Templater's data source, and then AE can ingest it. So that's how it's done. And so, it's a very powerful thing to be able to say your footage can exist anywhere. Templater doesn't care where the footage is. It will do its best to download it to the local machine, inject it into the layers, and render it out as a composite. And I think that what people are doing in that regard is pretty fascinating. We've seen stuff like the Gen AI stuff being fed in, but there's other things like a user UGC content where people upload a clip from when they take on their mobile phone and they use a web app or a mobile app to upload a file. That file doesn't go into AE; it goes into a S3. That URL that is then fed into Templater's data source. Then the actual asset is made. So that's kind of the way that I would suggest doing something like that.
That makes sense. And then the final piece, or one of the core elements, is spinning up a bunch of AE machines. Like if you're doing this for a large software business with many, many customers coming in all the time, you'd need to have this kind of a server set up somewhere. And
Yeah,
how would like someone start doing that? Like if they've never done that before, they don't have anything on-prem that they would do.
yeah. So so you got to have a queuing mechanism, right? Because if you have 1,000 people, wanting videos at the same time, you know, AE is not going to be able to handle all of that at the same time. So you have to have like a mechanism that sits between templater and the end user, and that's what queue is, right? It's like you're queuing up things, and then templater manages when it will actually kick off the queue or kick off the renders. If somebody doesn't have any experience with that, the best thing I can say is start using a no-code platform like what you're doing, and pipe data into a spreadsheet, into Google spreadsheets specifically, because they have an API, and then just connect templater to this spreadsheet. So, they can practice just by entering things in manually into the spreadsheet. And then when they're ready, they take a step back and say, okay, well, how can I get this spreadsheet to get data from all these other places? And that's when the no code platforms really open that possibility up, where it's like, oh, I want to connect, I don't know, my calendar to Google Sheets. Okay, well, that'll create a row in a new sheet, and that when that row shows up, templater is going to be like, okay, well, we're going to make a video based off of this. And the data can hold things that aren't just the data isn't just what changes in the composite. Part of the data can control After Effects. For example, in the data, you can specify an AEP project file, like an absolute path to a project file, and templater will open that file and use the other data to inject into that. So you can switch on a per row basis. You can change the template.
Oh,
So
interesting.
so it's not just about what you see changes. It's that you can control so many aspects of After Effects, namely the changing of the asset. But for example, you can have one project with 5 different compositions for 5 different resolutions, and there's a concept called a target composition. So when the data, if you have a target data point, like a property in the data, uh, templater will open up that particular composition in the project and render that one out. So what customers do if they have to support square, portrait, and landscape is that they'll have 3 rows in their spreadsheet with the same data, but only the target value changes. So they can get the 3 renders out at the 3 different formats. So, there's things like that. There's much more. For example, you can change the output module if you want to change the format of the movie file that gets rendered. You can change the render settings properties so that if you want to go through a whole set of things but not do a full render, you can do that. So there's, the data doesn't just control what you're seeing or hearing, it's controlling the actual application in a sense.
And then just as as someone who's never done this kind of work before, like say you had 5,000 renders you needed to do a day, like how would you spin that
Yeah.
up? Put it
Yeah.
like very vaguely because I've never done this before.
Right. So there is a way to do that where the suggestion or the way to approach it is to have multiple machines. So you can specify which jobs in your data source. So, for example, a row in a spreadsheet is considered a job. So you can assign jobs to different machines in the data source. There's a property that's called bot, stands for robot. And if you can name the bots from templater. So you can say this is Hal and this one is like Hal 2000. And so in your data source, you can say, I want these jobs to go to Hal and these jobs to go to Hal 2000. And then, it will distribute those render tasks between those 2 machines.
But
But I
you, as a
mentioned
developer, need to create those virtual machines with After Effects and templater in them, right?
that's right. Yeah, you would have to. Yes, you have to have those systems configured for the ability for it to open up the After Effects project and things like
And you'd
that.
have to have a certain number of those for it to run and not backlog too much,
That's
right?
right. And
Yeah.
it's really dependent on, well, how effects heavy is your template? How long? What's the duration? What is the average render time for one composite?
Hmm.
And this, I mentioned that company that has like a co-located rack. They have 30 machines. They're running like tens of thousands of jobs per month.
Mm.
They can do it. And the outputs are like, between 1 minute and 1 minute 30. So it's
Yeah.
they made a heavy investment, but they are successful in what they're doing, and they're in the higher education marketing area, meaning like college recruitment, scholarship information for specific students. So it's personalized information for higher ed students.
Nice.
So it's cool. I mean, it's built in a way so it's as flexible as possible, so that you know. But we don't, we're not going to make a claim that you can do like a million videos in a day or even a million videos in a month. It's like, what would you do with a million videos? It's just you kind of have to think of it as a
Definitely don't want to do a million videos a day or a month. Just the record.
but it's really about you know it's really about just thinking of it as a print house. If you have a brochure, you're working in InDesign, and you're like, you go to a print house and you say, I need 3,000 of these, and I need them today. They're going to look at you funny, and the reason is because, well, there's a lot of prep work, there's a lot of pre-flighting, there's a lot of testing, there's a lot of configuration, and that's how it is in video. People think that it's not that's not the case, but it is the case because it takes real computation to output and to render this stuff.
And presumably it does. Obviously, the fact that After Effects and you guys are so like broad and open, that's what allows enterprises to do what they want. But are there any other like tools that are just like way more like restricted and on rails that does a similar thing, but like sort of makes the process easier? Just like you might go to like Jitter for motion design, if you just want to make some text or shapes move.
Yeah, I mean, they have applications like even features in Express right now where it's like, do you need this graphic to be translated? Do you need this text element in this graphic to be translated? There's features like that. There are other tools out there that, they do similar things to what we do.
But nothing where you could like pipe in your custom like sources or like APIs and stuff like that, like generated audio and things like that.
Yes, there are other applications. I would be, as a business owner, I'd be a fool to mention them on your podcast,
sure.
Jack.
That's fine. I'm just interested. I'm trying to understand this landscape because I'm such a newbie with it.
There are other solutions. I would say though that our solution is going to be the only one in the Creative Cloud space that has a really, really nice user experience. So it's, again, what we've done here at Dataclay is not new. It is that we approached it in a way that makes it easy for designers and for people who are really motion graphics and post-production centric. There are, like, for example, Xerox. Xerox has a tool called XMPie, but it costs like, an exorbitant amount of money. Again, you're not going to get all the ability to do third-party effects from like Maxon and from, Boris. You're just not going to have that ability to get that After Effects feeling with those kinds of tools. And so yeah, I mean, in the world of After Effects, I'd say there are other tools, but they don't have a GUI. Like they don't have it's all developer centric, period. And that is not the approach that we wanted to take at the outset, because I came from a design background and I appreciate really great experiences with products. And so wrapping a very nice UI and on top of all of this, I think is critical to the success of a product. And so some users are going to say, you know what, I'm a developer, I really don't care about motion graphics. So they might go to that other competing product. That might be fine for them. But we really are about getting, the end user into this kind of space, but also giving them the ability to dive in and feel confident that they can accomplish it.
Yeah. I'm going to go and use Xerox right after this call and make my motion there. I would love to move again to this thing we've kept saying we were going to talk about, is like where AI is today and placing automation and AI gen together. Like you have a very interesting background, and perhaps you could just talk about your master's and the PhD as well, and just like, and what that kind of brings to the table. Cause I know you think about this deeply.
Yeah. So my master's degree was in interaction design. And basically that's the study of interactive products and interactive systems and understanding human computer interaction, how humans use machines to get tasks and work done and things accomplished. And, that helped me understand how to design a product so that it would be adoptable into one's existing tool set or, workflow. So that helped a great deal. And one of the things I learned there was that, just simple stuff like a splash screen. Splash screen, you don't really think about. You kind of think of it as an annoying, I got to wait for this. But actually, it serves a deeper purpose, which is, they're nostalgic. I've seen on LinkedIn, I think it was Iran Stern had like a series of like splash screens, and it's kind of like its face. It's the first thing you see, and you kind of develop a connection with it. When the new version comes out, it's kind of like, oh, this is the freshened up. So there's this human element to applications that are important, that help people feel comfortable adopting it, right? But there's more to it than that. There's micro interactions that you have to consider. There are the things that like messaging. There are the order of operations that things are executed at so people can really understand it. Like, does this dialogue make sense as a modal or a multimodal? Does this icon make sense? How is the rollover here? All these things, they add up. It's like the same kind of thing when you open up an Adobe app. You're inside an Adobe app because of all the small little things, the widgetry, not because of like the fact that it says Adobe somewhere. It's like you can tell the difference between an Autodesk app and an Adobe app very quickly. And so that kind of stuff is what I studied during the master's degree. And I kind of brought that to the table when I was building this product. Then, I was interested in more so how technology and image making would impact society, meaning like through all the tooling that we've had and all the development of tools, what kind of impact does the imagery that we make have on the way people interpret content and how believable it is? So I was interested in perceived credibility of media content for a very long time. That's what I did in my doctoral studies. And it's a topic that has always interested me because in part, it has to do with magic, and it also has to do with power. And I think those two things, the idea of a magician working with government, it's a very, it's an interesting thing to me because you wouldn't think that those two things would ever come together, but in fact, they do. So there's a lot of like, fictional movies about this, like Wag the Dog, The Running Man, Manchurian Candidate, where it's always about, some person, some VFX dude in some place changing something up for the news, right? And like tricking people. And I thought that was like, well, can that really, that's done because of technology. So I wanted to see the evolution of that. Like how did tech influence the way that, media is consumed? And, by the time I finished my doctoral studies, that was around 2008, the very beginning of 2008, the financial collapse in the United States had happened. And so, it was a very difficult time, particularly in academia, but also in industry. And so I kind of had to figure out what I was going to do. I had just graduated with a PhD. Nobody really wants a PhD in industry, and academics weren't hiring. So, I had to consult. I had to kind of like make do with what I had. And so, I started freelancing and whatnot, doing video game development, web development, anything I could kind of find my, or set my skills to. And, I'd say that like eventually what happened is, I started seeing that like this idea of media credibility started to become really relevant and salient, right? Like it started to become like really important. What was real? What is real? And I always thought that was that if I had stayed in that academic world, that my research would finally have been relevant and important for the larger, for a larger set of the population. But alas, I was more interested in helping the people who are creating the images get the content out. And I still think that, like, there is room for regulation to happen in the world of these apps that we use. And that was one of the conclusions that I'd come up with in my dissertation, was that, government regulation likely will need to play its hand in the creation of things like Photoshop, things like After Effects, that it's not enough for it to go, for it to keep developing without some kind of regulatory or watchdog body to be like, yo, like that algorithm is just not gonna fly. Or if you're gonna put that algorithm in, you're gonna have to do something to watermark it or to add metadata to it. And Adobe had come out with the Content Authenticity Initiative, the CAI. And that group is a consortium of companies to, help deal with what's called digital provenance, from the camera all the way to the post-production apps. And so I think, as we move forward in this world of video production, we're going to see more things happen both online and within the production apps that help end users, consumers, understand whether something has been manipulated or automatically generated, or it's going to become more transparent in the coming decade, is my guess. And I think Gen AI and just the idea of creating something that is out of thin air but that looks very highly realistic, from my perspective, it can be very dangerous. And especially coupled with the abilities of what After Effects can do and compositing applications can do. You can make anything look very real these days, and it's the definition of what will be considered or what will be perceived as real will change as well. And so it's I kind of take this whole thing probably more seriously than my colleagues in the industry. But it's because, I think that I don't think people realize how fragile society can be when this goes unregulated. Like, you can literally have a dissolution of the notion of truth. Societies can actually be, they can be harmed if stuff like this isn't controlled in some capacity. And I'm not talking about free speech. I'm not talking about what can be said. I'm talking about how things are made. That I think that's okay to regulate in terms of the notion of watermarking and digital provenance. I think I think that is a important thing to consider moving forward. Now, as far as getting Gen AI into the desktop apps, into After Effects and Photoshop, I think it's great. But what I think is the problem is, if they're going to, there's two things. One is the intellectual property of the original, machine learning sets of data. I think that it was a huge mistake to not inform the artists or the contributors before doing the machine learning. I think after the first experiments, there should have been some transparency there. That's a big issue right now. And then the second thing is just, the idea of not marking things as fake or not. And I think you see some of that. Like when you upload a video to Vimeo, there's actually a checkbox that says, does this have generative AI content in it? So there's going to be more of that. And we actually are using Gen AI in our next release for, well, what happens when the user doesn't have any data, right? Like, what we realize is that the designer realizes, like, oh, automation's great. Oh, I can use data to drive this, that. But then they realize, oh, I have to actually structure and collect data to build out my template. Like, I have to actually think as a data person to even prepare it to get into After Effects, right? So the idea is this, we want to use synthetic data that's kind of has a high degree of verisimilitude, where it looks real, but it's not. But it gets the artist going. It like allows them to hit the ground running, so that they don't have to actually structure and collect data. They can just, for example, one of the things that we're doing is what's called a layer prompt, where you're going to be able to tell a layer you're going to give a layer a prompt, and that when you preview with Templater, it'll just hit up one of these Chat GPTs or Claude, and it will get the response and put that into the layer. So right now it's working for text, and we're probably going to, in the second half of this year, we'll do that for footage. So I think that it's okay when it comes down to helping authors with placeholder information. I consider it kind of like intelligent lorem ipsum. It's not. It shouldn't be anything more than that. If you start to make claims that, I made this, it can get a little bit, hairy there. And I think that's the argument that's going on right now online with, there's the AI bro and the anti AI bro, right?
Yeah.
And it's, I don't know how it's going to play out, but I do know that it's AI and generative AI is not going away. I think the success of it is going to be how these corporations and these tool makers regulate it, and how they integrate it into workflows, and like what they will do as what they will deem as acceptable. So
Have you thought about, and maybe this is already happening, I'm sure it's probably happening, but like, what procedural SEO has gone through over the last 2 or 3 years has been like huge with obviously all the language models. Like, is that already happening with video? Do you see it happening very soon? And like, what do you think the impacts of that is going to be?
when you say procedural,
Like generating, like, say you're a company, you want to generate 20,000 videos about X topic and you just upload it to YouTube. Like, what are the,
yeah,
what,
yeah.
are we there now? Are we
No,
there
we're not there. We're
soon?
not going to get there. YouTube won't even allow that right now.
Right.
So they under like there's a fine line between what we do and what spammers do,
Yeah.
right? Like,
That's kind of the topic area I was interested in. What, like
yeah,
how you
so
about it.
we don't want to help. We don't obviously want to create spam. Like, that's not the reason that I built this tool. It's
No? What a
you know,
surprise.
yeah. So I don't think that we're going to. I think the whole notion of SEO. I think a lot of these companies like Google and Microsoft, they understand, like, they know what spam is, and so I don't think that is. I think there's going to be guardrails to avoid spam, in the future, especially now with data-driven content and all that kind of stuff. But I think I see it more as a if you carefully orchestrate the distribution of the content that's coming out of these kinds of tools, I think it's all good.
Mm.
But if it's like we're gonna trick a system into believing there's all this content happening over here, it's not gonna work. It's a futile endeavor.
But it's probably going to happen at some point for video. Like, even if you don't, even if you do all the right things as a company.
Yeah, I mean, there's bad actors everywhere you go, right? I mean, you can't avoid that. And I will say though that Templater got pirated, I think, like 3 years after it was released, and for a developer, it was like kind of like a rite of passage. It was like I was like they pirated it, like they cracked it. It was like I was like it means that it's significant. Granted, I don't like that they pirated it, but I mean, it hinders the bottom line, but it's a sign that there is something important going on with what you're building, and I think that's the only time when I appreciated the bad actor in the whole journey here is when they pirated Templater. That was a
Mom, I got
moment for me.
pirated.
Yeah,
It's
yes,
going really well.
yeah.
So, sort of moving towards wrapping up now, like, let's ask a really vague, open-ended question about like what the video producers and motion designers' role might be in 5 years in relation to all this. Like, maybe even 10. Like, how do you see this all playing out, and how do you see it changing?
In terms of how it's going to change in the future, how the role of the motion designer is going to change in the future, I think they're going to really have to consider that what they're building, what they're designing, isn't just a one-off, and that it's not just about that one render anymore. I really do believe that. I think that more producers are going to have to understand that their content is going to be needed to be localized, or made relevant to certain locales or to even individuals. And that means that they're going to have some kind of thing in their back of their head, like, well, where's the data coming from? What are the data points in my design that are going to be changing? What can change, or what can be dynamic? And I think that we're going to see more of that seep into the profession in some capacity. I just, the whole thing about creating this one composite that gets rendered out, I don't think that's ever going to go away. It's not that that's going to go away. It's that there's going to be this whole differentiation between doing that and then doing, something data driven, but it's going to be that data driven side is going to be more prominent as time goes on. And, I love craft. I think it's one of the greatest things about being an artist and a designer is the process of undergoing while you're making. I think that kind of relationship that the artist and the designer has with their tool is a sacred one. And I don't think that should ever be taken away from the human. But on the flip side, it's like you can still do that and incorporate data into that process. And I think that's why we call ourselves Dataclay, because it's something that an artist or a designer can use in the process. You can shape it in the way that you want. And I think that's really what it's all about for us, at least at Dataclay.
Nice. Last question, Arie, and thanks again so much.
Yeah.
Where do you, related to this, obviously, it's like, where do you see Dataclay being in 5 or 10 years? Like, perhaps you can give us a sense, however loosely, of the roadmap or just your vision about what you want it to be.
Yeah, I think, I'd like it obviously to grow into, we discussed other host applications. So I'd like to broaden the multiple, the applications that are out there, support those like DaVinci Resolve and, a lot of different apps, Cavalry and things like that. So there's that kind of aspect. Then there's the media orchestration thing, like what we're doing with Projector. And I also want to incorporate in that kind of post process a watermarking to make sure that people know that the content that they're seeing came out of a system like ours, right? So I want there to be more transparency in that regard. And I'd say that, I would really like to have more impact on real life experiences. One place where I'm seeing that is in, these agencies building venue graphics, but I really think that this idea of digital signage, I'm a big fan of, and like, understanding that market better and supporting that market better, either through developing networks specifically for digital signage, to tap into these kinds of automated systems, like that world as well. And ultimately, like, I'd say we want to be open enough in the same way that After Effects is, that we get more developers and we support a larger community, like more people are coming to the table, more developers are coming to the table. And eventually, hopefully it just becomes kind of a standard, which is difficult to do, with so many competing forces, but hopefully a workflow. I would like to see Dataclay's, the workflows that we've built over the years to be kind of a standard for a particular type of production. And, that's going to be hard, but we've been at it for 10 years and our customers keep on coming back. We are growing, and it's really, it's been a great ride. I mean, I feel blessed to have had this growth and to have had the reception from the community of users. And, I hope that just continues to grow to the point of, maybe it eventually becomes incorporated into the host app, by default, like it's just there. So, that's kind of where I see it going. And, it would be nice to support other mediums as well. Like, if holography takes off, or, these drone shows that are, they're making shapes and words in the sky. Like it would be nice to like support some of that in some capacity, right? But it's you know, it's an interesting world. Like I feel like Gen AI for images at least just came out of nowhere, and it just was like it kind of took over the whole world of image creation, and you know, we're making strides to support that, but you know, we'll see where things end up with that, and how we're going to incorporate it. But I think what we're doing now is a good first step. So
Nice. Ari, thanks so much for your time. This
yeah,
is deeply fascinating, and I appreciate
thank you, Jack.
getting
Yeah,
into it so deeply.
I was happy to do it, and I think you're a great interviewer. The questions are fantastic. I do enjoy watching others on your podcast, and
Great. I thought it was just my mum watching, so that's
no,
great, Ari.
no, there's more. There's more.
Okay.
So yeah, I wish you the best of luck in your continued journey to get the word out of what people are doing in this space. I don't think enough people understand the kind of fence between code and design, and I think you're doing a great job getting the message out. So thank you, and thanks for having me. Thanks for
Thank
having
you.
me. Yeah.